Okay, so on Monday, we left off talking about the different types of hormones that we have, or the ways that we classify them. And the last way that we learned that we classify them was based on whether they are lipid soluble or water soluble. We talked about differences in how they act on the cells. Remember, lipid soluble hormones are not going to travel in the bloodstream without a protein transporter. And then when they leave the blood, they then have the capacity to go directly into the cell, where they then alter the cell's activities by directly influencing stuff within the nucleus, which was gene expression, where we learned DNA makes RNA, which then makes proteins. And as we learned, proteins are the ones, or the things that actually alter the cell activity. Versus water soluble, which travel easily through the bloodstream by themselves. So they are going to travel in a free-form state, which unfortunately does mean that they will not be able to pass into the cell, but instead they have to activate what's called a second messenger system, which then results in the response through what we call phosphorylated proteins. So the proteins here again, just like proteins there, it's just the ultimate destination and how we get there. Or not the ultimate destination, but how we get to the destination that's different. So hopefully that still rings a bell. All right, let's transition now to talk about the hormones and their responsiveness. Responsiveness can be thought of as just how much of an effect that the hormones have. Okay, how strong they are in producing an effect. Okay. The responsiveness of a target cell to a hormone is dependent upon three things. And two of these we really kind of talked about the other day. The concentration of the hormone, the number of receptors the target cell has for the hormone, which we learned the other day can go up and down. We talked about upregulation versus downregulation, therefore affecting the responsiveness. And then influences exerted by other hormones, which is kind of what we're talking about down here. In some cases, actions of some hormones on target cells requires a simultaneous or recent exposure to a second hormone. Down at the bottom, we've got three graphs to represent synergism, permissiveness, and antagonism. Okay. Synergism is shown here with the letter B with a, as it's labeled here, a synergistic effect. And we've got two hormones, J and K. Doesn't matter what the actual hormones are. Individually, if they are produced and released, have a pretty minimal effect on or response on the target cell. But if they're released together, look at the response. It's very significant. Okay. So synergism is a combination of hormones having a greater effect on a target cell than the sum of the effects each would have if acting alone. Okay. If you added J and K up by themselves, the response would be just here. But together, when you actually add them together, they produce a great response. Example, estrogen and follicle-stimulating hormone both do the same thing. Together, they really do a great job of causing egg cell development in the ovaries. And so that's pretty cool. If you've ever heard of the term synergy, synergy is a buzzword you see a lot of times in like business, corporate world. Okay, hear about promoting synergy. It means working together as a team towards a common goal. If you work together as a team, you're going to get there and you're going to do a better job than working alone, basically. Permissiveness is shown down here with letter A, permissive effects. Hormone A by itself, very little response. But with a permissive hormone present, hormone A has a really good response. Okay. So permissiveness occurs when a small amount of one hormone allows the second hormone to have its full effect on a target cell. I always think permissive permits another hormone to really get the job done. Okay. And then antagonism, you can see down here with the letter C. Hormone X is elevated while hormone Y is really low, and then they flip-flop. Okay, because they do opposite things. Like insulin and glucagon, which insulin we secrete when we are high in blood sugar, like after a meal. It lowers your blood sugar. Well, after a few hours of insulin, your blood sugar might drop to the point where you release glucagon, which elevates your blood sugar. So this enables really nice fine-tuning of conditions like blood sugar. We'll even see the same type of thing with blood calcium, which is regulated by antagonistic hormones. So we'll see a couple examples of antagonistic hormones. Insulin, glucagon. Insulin and glucagon is just one. All right, the release of those hormones occurs in short bursts, kind of like they're spitting out. Okay, spits it out in these short bursts. Very little secretion between the bursts. And regulation of secretion is done 4 ways. And those are illustrated here on the right with A, B, C, and D figures. On the right here, letter A is showing, number 1, signals coming from the nervous system, which we've seen before. Hey, remember from previous lectures, we've learned that whenever the sympathetic nervous system is activated, we release a lot of epinephrine or adrenaline, and then smaller amounts of norepinephrine and dopamine. And that's part of that fight or flight response that we've talked a lot about this semester. Chemical changes in the blood. I was just talking about high blood sugar, low blood sugar. Okay, well, over here on the right, they're using low blood calcium as a stimulus for secretion. Okay. When we are low in blood sugar, what we call hypocalcemia, we stimulate the release of parathyroid hormone from the parathyroid glands. It does certain things, we'll learn about what those are on Friday, that elevate blood sugar. Well, if our blood sugar gets too high, then we're going to use another hormone to lower it back down. Okay. But when we elevate that blood sugar or blood calcium, what we don't want to continue doing is releasing PTH, because that can cause our blood calcium to get too high. So we will feed back and shut off the release of PTH from the parathyroid, which is a demonstration of negative feedback, which we've seen all semester long. Most of our hormonal control systems are by way of negative feedback. As we do know, though, one example, childbirth, which actually happens to be shown down here in letter C, is regulated by positive. Okay? Which we know childbirth is stimulated, or the release of oxytocin, I should say, is stimulated when the cervix stretches, because distension or stretching of an organ can stimulate the release of hormones. And we'll see the same thing when we get to the stomach. Talk about how when it stretches, it stimulates the secretion of things. In this case, it's the cervix. And then other hormones can tell other glands to release hormones. Okay, for example, your anterior pituitary gland releases ACTH, which tells the adrenal cortex to release a hormone called cortisol. And if cortisol levels go up, it'll feed back and shut off the release of anterior pituitary gland hormone ACTH, and therefore demonstrating negative feedback. All right, what we're going to do now is run through those various organs of the endocrine system and learn about the hormones that they produce. And we're going to start with a familiar structure. Familiar because we've talked a lot about it this semester. Our hypothalamus. Structure that links our nervous system and our endocrine system. We learned previously that it's the major control center of our autonomic nervous system. We also learned that it's the major control center of our endocrine system. So it's very, very important. It controls the endocrine system because it produces at least 9 hormones. There might be more that we're not familiar with, but we know at least 9 are produced. These hormones act on the pituitary, which the pituitary is an organ that dangles right below the hypothalamus. And you can actually break down the pituitary into 2 parts, the anterior and posterior parts, which we can see here on this page. Okay. Even though collectively anterior and posterior make up the pituitary as a whole, they could not be any more different. They even develop and come from different places in the body. Your posterior pituitary is an extension of the hypothalamus. Two hormones are made in the hypothalamus, but are then released by the posterior pituitary. We have 7 hormones. The other 7, okay, 2 plus 7 is 9. The other 7 hormones are called releasing and inhibiting hormones, and they act on the anterior pituitary. And the anterior pituitary will either release hormones or stop releasing hormones in response to those 7 hormones. If it's a releasing hormone, it's going to tell the anterior pituitary to release a hormone. Guess what inhibiting hormones do? They stop the release of hormones or a hormone from the anterior pituitary. The connection that exists between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary is very unique. We have what's called a portal blood flow connection, which is fairly rare in the body. There's only a couple places where we see this. Okay. I'm going to draw up on the board a simple flow chart to demonstrate the way that blood typically flows in our body. And in normal circulation, blood will leave the heart and enter our arteries. Arteries are the vessels that carry blood away from the heart to our capillaries. Capillaries are where we do exchange. Okay, it would be like where the hormones are picked up into the blood, or where they leave the blood to go to their target cells. Okay. From capillaries, they then travel into veins. And then from veins, they go back to the heart. For most of our hormones, for example, your 2 hormones from the posterior pituitary, they are released into capillaries, and before they can go to the place that they need to go, they must return back to the heart and then get pumped out through arteries and get carried to the body to make their way to the capillaries within the target organ. So it's a very indirect route. But with a portal system, we pump blood from the heart into arteries, then into capillaries. So the first couple steps are the same. But then we have either one or multiple portal veins, which then carry the blood to a second set of capillaries. And then we make our way into the veins and then on to the heart, which allows for hormones to get carried from one thing directly to another before we have to even take it to the heart. And we can see that in our figure here, right where my cursor is, with those 2 hypophyseal portal veins. Hormones are released here, carried directly here. It's a direct connection. Okay. Another example of where we see this is between our intestines, our stomach, and our liver. So if you've taken anatomy, you learn when we talked about and drew all those arteries and veins in the body about the hepatic portal system. That was one that we covered towards the end of the semester. So some of you guys hopefully can remember that. Like I said, the connection that exists between the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus is much different than the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary is just an extension of the hypothalamus. In fact, the cell bodies of neurons are found in the hypothalamus, and the end of those neurons are down in the posterior pituitary. So literally it is an extension of the hypothalamus. Okay. Let's look at our very first set of hormones. These are those releasing and inhibiting hormones that act on our anterior pituitary that are released by the hypothalamus. On the board over here, I left it up from last class, but for the many hormones that we're going to be talking about, you're going to want to know 4 things. secretes them? In this case, it's easy because it says at the top, hypothalamic hormones. So these 7 are secreted by the hypothalamus. Who do they target? In this case, anterior pituitary. Stimulus for secretion, so what causes them to be released? And their principal effect, or effects, which you can see principal effects are listed here in this table that I created. For some of the hormones, you don't need to know all 4 things, because, for example, here, I only give you 3 of those 4 things. Who secretes it? Hypothalamus. Who it targets? Anterior pituitary. Principal effects. So what's missing? Stimulus for secretion. Okay. Because it can be kind of complicated with these 7 hormones. So that's why I didn't include it. Now, in a couple slides, when we talk about the hormones from the anterior pituitary, we're actually going to learn some of their stimulus for secretion. But I'm not going to worry about you knowing for these. Because the stimulus for secretion of these is going to affect the stimulus for secretion, or is part of the stimulus for secretion for some of the hormones from the anterior pituitary. These hormones are easy because they either tell the anterior pituitary to release a hormone or tell it not to. Okay. For example, thyroid stimulating, or thyroid releasing hormone, thyroid releasing hormone tells the anterior pituitary to release thyroid stimulating hormone. That's a great example of how roundabout things go with the endocrine system sometimes. I like to think of it like working a job. Okay, you've got a boss and you've got a boss's boss, right? Sometimes the boss's boss tells your boss to do the job. And what's your boss turn around to do? He passes it to me. He passes it to you. Okay. The boss's boss, CEO of our endocrine system, is our hypothalamus. Number 2 in charge, anterior pituitary. Okay. So the boss's boss, in this case, tells the boss, your boss, to release thyroid stimulating hormone. Guess what thyroid stimulating hormone does? Stimulates the thyroid. The thyroid is the actual peon that actually does the job. It releases T3 and T4. We'll talk about that here in a minute. Okay. So sometimes you end up with multiple hormones being released by different things before anything actually gets done. Just like what happens in the workforce. And that just demonstrates how slow things can be going and how indirect things can be for the endocrine system. Very different than what we saw with the nervous system, which was instantaneous. Other hormones. Corticotropin releasing hormone tells the anterior pituitary to release a hormone called adrenocorticotropic. Gonadotropin releasing hormone tells the anterior pituitary to release LH and FSH. Then we've got 2 pairs of opposite hormones. A prolactin releasing and a prolactin inhibiting hormone. Prolactin releasing tells the anterior pituitary to release prolactin. Prolactin inhibiting tells it to stop releasing prolactin. And then GHRH and GHIH either stimulate or inhibit the release of growth hormone. Okay. So this set of hormones, these 7, are fairly easy. You have pretty simple effects. And I gave you right off of that who secretes it and its target. Speaking of that target, the anterior pituitary, it's our next structure that we're going to discuss. Once upon a time, it was believed that the anterior pituitary gland was the major gland of the endocrine system. But we just talked about the fact that it's controlled by the hypothalamus. So we now know that the hypothalamus is the major control center of the endocrine system. But the anterior pituitary would be thought of as like number 2 in charge. Okay. It is a true and major endocrine gland. When I say true and major, that means it produces and secretes its own hormones. We're not going to see that with the posterior pituitary. Okay. The stimulus for secretion of these is, or regulation, I should say, by way of those hormones that we just talked about. Releasing would cause hormones to be released by the anterior pituitary. Inhibiting would shut them down. On top of that, we also have negative feedback that will regulate the release of these hormones. Okay. We classify the hormones as either tropic or trophic. Refers to what they do. Okay. In fact, one of the hormones, adrenocorticotropic hormone, literally has the word tropic in it. Tropic hormones act on other endocrine glands. So these are kind of the guys that tell some other gland to release a hormone. Okay. Adrenocorticotropic hormone tells the adrenal cortex to release hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone tells the thyroid to release a hormone. Whereas trophic hormones, with an H in there, cause growth of the target organs or cells. Okay. There are 7 hormones that are released by the anterior pituitary, and they are released by 5 different cells. So a couple of the cells secrete 2 different hormones. Let's look at the first 4 hormones released by the anterior pituitary. I've already talked about a couple of these because these were directly discussed with the hypothalamus. First hormone is growth hormone. Just generally how you'll see me write it and say it. The book calls it human growth hormone. It's the same thing. You can either abbreviate it as GH or HGH. The other name for it, and this is not that important, I'm not going to worry about it, the other name for these hormones, is somatotropin. The reason it's called somatotropin, because the cells that secrete it are called somatotropes. Okay? That's where that name comes from. The function of human growth hormone is exactly what it sounds like. It promotes growth. That's not all it does. Okay? How it promotes growth is through the stimulation of insulin-like growth factor secretion. Okay? We're going to talk about IGS towards the end of this lecture. They promote growth through a variety of means. Another stimulus for secretion of growth hormone would be to help, or another action I could say, is regulating aspects of metabolism. Okay. The major stimulus for secretion and direct stimulus for secretion of this is that growth hormone releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. Okay. Which, I told you a second ago, you don't need to worry about the stimulus for secretion of those releasing and inhibiting hormones. But GHRH, growth hormone releasing hormone, is actually released in response to hypoglycemia. Hypoglycemia is a fancy way to describe low blood sugar. The prefix hypo means low. Okay. Glycemia refers to glucose or sugar. Okay. So this would be like after a fasting state. You wake up in the morning, you're probably releasing growth hormone because you're probably low in blood sugar. Okay. We also secrete it in response to decreased fatty acids, increased amino acids in our blood, deep sleep, any increased sympathetic activity, and the release of hormones like cortisol, glucagons, estrogens, and insulin. So there's just a few effects, but a lot of stimulus for secretion here. TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, is also known as thyrotropin because it's released by cells called thyrotropes. Does exactly what it sounds like. It stimulates the thyroid and stimulates the secretion of hormones from the thyroid. Secreted directly in response to the release of TRH from the hypothalamus, thyrotropin releasing hormone. We release that when our blood is low in T3 and T4 or when our metabolism is low. Okay. So I said you wouldn't need to know stimulus for secretion of TRH. But since TRH is secreted when our blood T is low in T3 and T4, and when our metabolic rates are low, you can also say that TSH is stimulated by low levels of T3 and T4 and low metabolic rates. The next two hormones go together. These are collectively known as the gonadotropins. They're released by cells called gonadotrophs, which if you look at the beginning of those words, gonadotropins and gonadotrophs, begin with the word gonad, or gonads, which will be plural because gonads are the egg-producing ovaries in females and the sperm-producing testes in men. That's what they target. Okay. Follicle-stimulating hormone stimulates ovaries to initiate development of the oocytes, which are egg cells that develop in bubbles called ovarian follicles. It also stimulates follicular cells, or cells in the ovaries, to secrete estrogens in females. Okay. That's what it does in females. Men don't have ovaries. We have testes, and we produce testosterone in our testes as a result of FSH secretion. LH in females stimulates ovulation, which is where the egg is released into the fallopian tubes. When that happens, a corpus luteum is formed. We'll talk about that later in the semester. Progesterone and estrogens are also secreted in response to luteinizing hormones, or luteinizing hormone. In the testes, it stimulates testosterone production, so it's similar to what FSH does. As I mentioned, they're collectively known as the gonadotropins, because they're released by gonadotrophs. And the stimulus for secretion is the same for both of these. GRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. Okay. Gonadotropin releasing hormone stimulates the release of gonadotrophs, which are FSH and LH. Okay. Pretty amazing, but our brain is actually in charge of reproduction as well. Okay. Without our brain, hypothalamus, anterior pituitary, we would not be able to produce eggs or sperm. Okay. The last three anterior pituitary hormones are prolactin, adrenocorticotropic hormone, and then melanocyte-stimulating hormone. Prolactin is a very important female hormone because this is a hormone that causes the release of milk from the mammary glands. Okay, now that first sentence there promotes milk secretion by mammary glands by cells known as lactotrophs kind of is worded poorly on my part. Lactotrophs are not the cells that produce the milk and secrete them, or not the mammary glands. Lactotrophs are the cells in the anterior pituitary that release prolactin, that stimulates those glands to produce the milk. Okay. Stimulus is pregnancy, because that's when females are going to begin to make milk. After pregnancy, by prolactin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. Now, men, we're not really sure what it does. But if a person has hypersecretion, we've said hypo is low, hyper is high. So excess levels of prolactin would cause erectile dysfunction. That's kind of interesting. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, very long named hormone. If you break down the word adrenocorticotropic, we already learned what tropic meant. It begins with adreno. We've learned about the adrenal glands before. Okay? We talked about the adrenal medulla. Well, this targets the adrenal cortex. Okay. Cort is in the middle of the word. Okay, it's at the beginning of the word cortex. Cort is also found in the word glucocorticoids, which are the hormones that are stimulated for secretion by the adrenal cortex in response to the release of ACTH. Okay, the other name for it is corticotropin, released by corticotropes. Corticotropes also secrete the latch hormone. Okay. This hormone is released in response to corticotropin releasing hormone by the hypothalamus. Okay. Cortisol is the actual hormone, which also has cort in it. It is your stress hormone. So any stress-related stimuli causes the release of this hormone. Okay. Hypoglycemia, we said, is low blood sugar. That's a stress. Physical trauma is a stress. So those stimulate the release of ACTH. At the very end of this lecture, we'll talk about the stress response, and we'll see ACTH involved in that. The last hormone, melanocyte-stimulating hormone, we're not really sure what it does. There are receptors for it in the brain, suggesting it may influence our activity of the brain. Little circulating MSH in our body in a normal state. If you administer it for several days, they can produce a darkening of the skin. If you've taken anatomy, you learned about melanocytes. Those were the cells of our skin that give us our skin color, give us melanin. That's what sounds straightforward, that melanocyte stimulating hormone would stimulate those cells, but we don't produce much of it in normal cases. Okay. If we release too much corticotropin releasing hormone, it will cause the release of this hormone in high numbers. So that's interesting. I assume someday we'll kind of figure out what it does. Maybe not for a while though. Maybe not. Here, table 18.4 is just a nice summary of all those hormones that we just talked about. It gives you the hormone. It tells you who secretes it, anterior pituitary. It tells you who it targets. It gives you its principal action. So that's nice. It gives you 3 out of those 4 things that I wanted you to know. Here is a figure that just demonstrates the relationship, once again, between the hypothalamus with the hormones, either releasing or inhibiting, pushed into the capillaries of the hypothalamus that then are connected to the capillaries of the anterior pituitary by the portal veins, and then that directly causes the release of the several hormones that we just talked about. Now, interestingly enough, when negative feedback is involved with the anterior pituitary, it's also going to be involved with the hypothalamus. On the right there, we show eventually the release of cortisol from the adrenal cortex, which we just learned is released in response to ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. But we learned that that was released in response to corticotropin-releasing hormone. So there's a lot of steps involved with the actual release of cortisol. Well, if cortisol levels get built up, they can feed back and shut off the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus. So we've kind of got a double negative feedback situation going on. Because you've got 2 hormones leading to the 3rd hormone being released. So we have to shut off the first 2 when the 3rd is elevated. Okay. So it's kind of cool. Unfortunately, there are conditions that can develop as a result of anterior pituitary hormone imbalances. And I've got a couple figures down here at the bottom demonstrating some of those, or 2 of these 3 imbalances. The first one is giantism. Makes sense based on its name, what it does. This develops a really tall and large person. And I'm talking super tall. Okay, not just 6'4". Okay, I'm talking huge. It is a condition that develops in growing people, so kids. Okay, and then into, teenage years, when kids finally stop growing, generally. Okay. It can be due to a pituitary or hypothalamic tumor, resulting in too much GH being released. Too much growth hormone causes too much growth. Okay. Anybody recognize the guy down here in the bottom in sweatpants and sweatshirt? You guys know who Shaq is? How tall is Shaq? Anybody know? 7 foot. He's standing next to a model or a mannequin of the tallest man to ever live. at least we know of. Looks like a little baby next to him, doesn't he? Tallest man to ever live, 9 foot. He would almost hit the ceiling in this room. I'm assuming it's a 10-foot ceiling. Might be. Yeah. That's insane. Unfortunately, this is a very, very bad, not cool thing. A lot of health problems go along with this. So, pretty much the opposite of giantism is dwarfism. Okay, this is where there's really low levels of growth hormone being released, and so people become really short. The great thing is this one can be treated pretty easily because you can get synthetic forms of growth hormone and supplement, and so it can help the kids grow to a normal size. Okay. Now, acromegaly is similar to giantism because it's excess growth hormone, except this happens in adults. So it might not be a bad idea to highlight or underline the word adults, okay? Because adults cannot grow any taller because their growth plates have fused shut. So if you can't grow taller, which way can you grow? Wider. And that leads to bones that get real thick and boxy. Can be very bad and cause a lot of deformities. Happens a lot like the mandible. You can see a picture of this guy here. Chin looks really huge. It is. And a lot of times you'll see like a protruding forehead. Happens a lot in the digits and toes. So their fingers get kind of mangled, their toes get mangled, and even their back can get pretty mangled. So not a good thing there either. All right, our next gland is our posterior pituitary. Once again, your posterior pituitary is just an extension of the hypothalamus. And you can see that here on the next page with these neurons, which we call neurosecretory cells because they secrete hormones. The cell bodies are located up in the thalamus. The axons run down into the posterior pituitary. And the hormones that were produced back up in the hypothalamus are released in the posterior pituitary. So we cannot classify the posterior pituitary as a true endocrine gland because it doesn't produce and secrete its own hormones. It does store and release the two hormones, oxytocin and antidiuretic. Oxytocin we've talked about before. That's that hormone that's involved in labor and the uterine contractions of females. Okay. It is the hormone that's stimulated for secretion when the cervix is stretching. Okay. We've talked about that since the beginning of the semester when we first talked about positive feedback. Okay. It also aids in lactation. Lactation is the production and release of milk by women. Okay. So it stimulates milk injection from mammary glands. And this is stimulated when suckling of the nipple occurs. There are channels or there are receptors in the nipple of the female that are activated when the baby suckles, and that helps to push the milk out. So that's pretty cool. Now, that's fine and all, but females don't go through childbirth their entire life. They don't breastfeed their entire life, and men don't do either of those things. Okay? So looking at the function in males and non-pregnant females, we're not really sure what it does. But research on animals does suggest that it may have to do with caretaking behaviors as well as feelings of sexual pleasure. The second hormone released by the posterior pituitary is antidiuretic hormone. An antidiuretic hormone does the opposite of what a diuretic does. Anybody know what a diuretic does? If you're a nurse, you might have heard of people being put on diuretics. what they are? What they make you do? They make you pee. They can pee a lot. So people get put on diuretics if they're like really swollen or they have a lot of fluid around their heart, something like that. Okay. Great example of a diuretic, and I don't know if you guys that are underage, if you've ever experienced this, is alcohol. Which does what to you? The more you drink. Makes you pee a whole lot, and you wake up the next day really hungover, which a hangover is just a way to describe you being really dehydrated. Okay. When you wake up dehydrated, you're going to be releasing antidiuretic hormone, trying to conserve what water you still have in your body. Okay. It does so by decreasing urine production by causing the kidneys to return more water to the blood, and it even decreases water loss through sweat. Okay. Its stimulus for secretion is a blood osmotic pressure increase, which is just a fancy way to describe decreased blood volume. Okay. Blood volume is the amount of blood, which is directly correlated to how much water we have, because there's a lot of water in our blood and our plasma. I was talking about that in extras this morning. Okay. Okay. So that's a fancy way to describe dehydration. We could even just be lacking blood altogether because we are losing it through a hemorrhage, which is a fancy way to describe a cut, which can be internal or external. Bleeding. Okay. Diarrhea, we know that all causes to lose a lot of water, or even just excessive sweating. Now we're going to talk about this hormone when we get to the cardiovascular system because of its role with regulating blood pressure. Okay. It's also known as vasopressin because it elevates blood pressure by doing blood vessel constriction. And if you ever heard of somebody being put on vasopressors or pressors, that's what they're talking about. Something that will elevate blood pressure. All right, the last organ that we're going to get to talk about today is the thyroid gland. It's our largest endocrine gland. It's a true endocrine gland. It secretes and produces its own hormones. It does so in sacs called thyroid follicles, which are full of a protein-rich colloid. Earlier in the semester, very beginning of the semester, we talked about suspensions and solutions and colloids. Colloids were kind of the thickest examples of mixtures. Okay, it's kind of a really thick fluid in this case. And that's where the two hormones are produced, T3 and T4. And we'll look at how they're produced in a second. Okay. T3 is short for triiodothyronide. T4 is short for tetraiodothyronide. So you're never going to need to know that, really. T3 and T4 is a lot easier to say and spell. And you might see T4 written out as thyroxine. It's kind of its third name. So you might want to make sure you know thyroxine to go with T4. Okay? But my guess is you'll probably only ever have to really worry about T3 and T4. These two hormones do similar things, or basically work together to do the same thing. And that is primarily to increase our basal metabolic rate. What I mean by that is our metabolism. Speed up chemical reactions in our body, because that's what metabolism is. Okay. We increase the number of TH hormones in our blood to increase metabolic rate, and that's done by increasing the rate of oxygen consumption when we are in a standard basal condition, where we're awake, at rest, and in a fasting state. How this is done is by stimulating the use of ATP production through the use of oxygen. And we make ATP from carbs and fats and a little bit of proteins once in a while. So when our BMR increases as a result of T3 and T4, we metabolize those carbs, lipids, and proteins. Second major effect of the thyroid hormones is to stimulate the sodium potassium ATPase pumps, which utilizes ATP, as we know, pumping sodium and potassium against their concentration gradient And we know that anytime we're performing chemical reactions like that, heat is produced as a byproduct. This ATP using process will help elevate our body temperature. We call this phenomenon the calorogenic effect. Since the beginning of the semester, we've talked about the feedback loop regulating body temperature, and we said when it's cold outside, we shiver. Guess what else we now get to know we do? We release T3 and T4. Okay. It's like lighting a fire in our body. Other things that T3 and T4 do: protein synthesis, use of glucose, fatty acids for ATP production, enhance the action of the catecholamine hormones, which we'll talk about. That's epi and norepi, and then helps with body growth. Okay. Stimulus for secretion relates to fat in our brain with the thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. That then tells the anterior pituitary to release thyroid stimulating hormone. Now TRH is stimulated for secretion when we are low in T3 or T4, or if we have a low metabolic rate. So technically, stimulus for secretion T3 and T4 will be low levels of them, or a low metabolic rate. Or situations that increase or require ATP, such as being cold, like I just said, hypoglycemia, okay, high altitude, pregnancy, and then secretion of thyroid hormones. Yeah, you wouldn't really need to worry too much about the target organ there. Now, the production and release of thyroid hormones is a little bit unique because the thyroid gland actually stores its secretions in bulk. It's a 8-step process, as you can see over here on the right and on the left. Begins with pulling iodine out of the blood and into the follicular cells, okay, which then trap that iodine, is why we call it iodine trapping. Okay. While that's occurring, we synthesize a protein called TGB, thyroglobin, which is produced by the RAR, moved from the RAR to the Golgi, and then out of the Golgi into that space where we find the colloid, that fluid. Okay. Step 3 is where we oxidize iodide. Some of the amino acids in TGB are tyrosines that become iodinated. In order to bind to tyrosine, they must undergo oxidation to form iodine, which is I2. Okay. As those I2 molecules form, they react with tyrosines of TGBs to form mono and dityrosines. We know the prefix mono means 1 and di means 2. Well, what happens when you add 1 and 2 together? You get 3. What happens if you add 2 and 2 together? You get 4. Remember the names of those two hormones? T3 and T4. That's where that comes from. Okay. Now, once we form T3 and T4, we pull it back into the cells and then put it into our bloodstream, where it must bind to a receptor because they are lipid soluble. The receptors, or not receptors, but the transporters carry the hormone to their target destination. Okay. Real quick, we'll talk here about these thyroid hormone imbalances, and then we'll call it quits. Thyroid hormone imbalances, in some cases, can actually be traced back to the brain with the hypothalamus and the pituitary. Okay, since those are the two places where we stimulate the secretion of the T3 and T4. Okay. We've got hyperthyroidism, which we said hyper meant what? High. So this is where we have way too much T3 and T4. Okay. Causes things like metabolic or an increased metabolic rates, weight loss, irritability, and various cardiovascular changes. Sometimes you see this in Graves' disease, which is an autoimmune disease caused by abnormal antibodies against TSH receptors. So we end up releasing way too much TSH, so the thyroid is overactive. Okay. Over here on the bottom right, we can see exophthalmos. which is where the eyes protrude outward because of swelling that occurs behind them. And that's very indicative of people that have Graves' disease. Okay. On the left, you see a goiter, which also happens in many cases with hyperthyroidism. Have you ever seen somebody with a goiter before? It's like a little big old ball is right there in their throat, as you can see that lady. Hypo, we said, was low. Hypothyroidism disorder characterized by low secretion of thyroid hormones. These people are generally a lot of times going to be really heavy. Okay, if you ever hear somebody say they have a thyroid condition, a lot of times they're saying that because they are rather large. Okay, their metabolisms were low, so they don't have an easy way of burning calories. And then cretinism is also known as congenital hypothyroidism, thyroid deficiency that develops in infants and children, results in dwarf and mentally confused or mentally deficient children due to abnormal brain development. Have you ever heard of somebody being called a cretin before? It's a very terrible derogatory term, and that's probably where it comes from. So, now that you know what cretinism means or is, I would probably recommend you don't use the word cretin to describe somebody.